Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today on this gorgeous day across Ontario and being part of this Q&A session for Dom's video tutorial today. My name is Margaret Merkley and I chair the program committee and I am the president of the Ontario Guild of English Handbell Ringers.
Hello there, I'm Maggie Sun and I'm excited to be joining Marg as your co-moderator for today's Q&A session. I'm a member of the OGEHR Communications Committee and I serve as the email coordinator and send out the email tree to our membership on a weekly basis.
So the tutorial today has been put together by Dominique Moreau and we thank him for that, but we also thank him for his future endeavors. He's going to put several videos, tutorials together, and they are on active listening, how to use a metronome, meters, and malleting bells. So this is a great cross-section of tutorials that are lined up for between 2020 2021, and we hope that you'll be able to join in those as well.
Welcome, Dominique.
Hi.
So Dom is our clinician and tutorial host for today. He is a percussionist and a music teacher who resides in Ottawa. Dom plays with the Ottawa Symphony Orchestra and teaches at Gisèle-Lalonde High School, as well as the Ottawa Youth Orchestra. He plays with the St. Andrew's Ringers. Welcome, Dominique. So at this point, we will be taking questions submitted via the Zoom text chat.
Dom, I'm going to read it and give it back to you. So it's a question from Maggie in Ottawa. When you pick up the bell to back ring, do you reverse it so that the clapper direction is reversed?
That's a very good question. No, I do not. It needs a bit more strength to get the clapper to go back. If you compare it to when you shake a smaller bell, it's kind of that idea that you'll need a lot of energy to shake the bell so the clapper reaches both sides. And it's the same idea. You'll need a lot of energy to get the clapper to go on the back of the casting. That's the back of the clapper. If you're using the Schulmerich, it's easy because the clapper has the same hardness on both sides. Opposite. If you're using the Malmark, it's a bit more difficult, but it will be a very, very quick motion, and with the energy you're going to put in, the clapper will be able to reach the back of the casting, even though it's not the direction it was intended to go. That's why I use it mostly for loud notes. It doesn't really work well for soft notes because you're using, you need that much more energy to bring the clapper to the back of the casting.
Neat. So I actually, Dom, when you are ringing or back ringing or even just ringing bass bells, do you need to modify your grip compared to a player, say, in the battery? What adjustments would you make?
Grip-wise, it's very similar. Your thumb and index should be sort of pointing forward before you grip the bell. It's very similar to what you're going to do for a smaller bell. It's just even more important on the bass bells because of the added weight can create health issues if you're not doing it correctly. Like at first I was not holding the bell correctly. So really the back of the handle should be sitting in this part of your hand here, so you can really have your thumb and index evenly around the rest of the handle.
Right, yeah, because I guess with a smaller bell, because it's lighter, you're able to, kind of, that technique, if you're not holding the bell properly, it's not as obvious, where with a heavy bell, it really does become apparent. If your technique isn't good, you can really lead to wrist strain. I'm guilty of this. I hurt myself playing bass bells. I tried to reach for a bell quickly. That was just out of position. And as I grabbed it, I had my wrist turned. I tried to grab it awkwardly, and as I grabbed it, I felt something go right here on the upper part of this part of my lower arm, and right where it kind of pins to the elbow, and that led to maybe 6 or 8 months of regret.
Yes. The weight of the bells can be very can hurt you because your wrist doesn't have any muscle It all happens in this part here. So anything that happens in your hand happens here.
Right. So do you, I know that you talked about, wearing gloves and extra padding. Do you also, what do you think about wrist support?
I've never used it, but it's not a bad idea. Definitely, like if you find that often your wrists are sore after practice or after playing, it's probably a good idea to get a wrist brace. And they're not too expensive. You can get them at Shoppers, for example, for like $20-$25. They're very similar to the elbow braces you'll get for tennis elbow and other similar health issues, but sometimes it's good to use them to prevent the issues instead of as a response to the health issues.
Right, to be proactive. Awesome. Thanks, Dom.
No problem.
Dom, Maggie has another question, and this sort of maybe is a segue from what you were just mentioning. Is the forward motion driven more by the upper arm or by the forearm?
Good question. Let me think about it for a second. I need to bring in the air just so I can get my... So the way, first of all, the way you need to think of it is the motion is the same between the small bells and the big bells. It's not a difference in motion. It's a difference of where the motion is actuated. So if you're doing a small bell, your wrist is getting the clapper to hit, but then your forearm will move to get that circle, right? And don't hesitate yet to do it in the air so you can feel it. Your forearm is moving. So now we're just going to translate those motions to bigger joints. So instead of the wrist bringing the clapper forward, it's your entire forearm that will drop down. That the wrist doesn't move. The entire forearm comes down. That brings the clapper forward, and yes, your shoulder, your entire arm will be doing the circle. So it's the motion, the bell motion is similar. The bell travels the same way. You're just using different parts of your body to do the two parts of the motion, if you will. I don't know if that's a helpful deconstruction, but that's how I think of it. Okay, great.
So what consequences, I mean, if I'm used to ringing in the battery or high bells, and I'm used to using my wrists when I ring, if I, when I'm transitioning to the big bells, I'm used to that motion. Should I be changing my motions? What happens if I don't?
Well, possibly you can hurt yourself. That's the worst thing that can happen.
Right.
It happened to me earlier. That's why I got good at ringing the bass bells healthily. The best trick I can give you actually is to try to change the motion so you're doing them right. And I know it's hard to undo habits. It's not easy. So the ideal ways to do it is try to, for me, it's really helpful to deconstruct things and practice every specific motion. So that when I'm back to playing in context, I've practiced it. So I break things down into their smaller components and then put them back together one after the other. And then you have to repeat that. It sort of has to become muscle memory, that the bell's heavy, I'm going to ring it that way. If you always do it the right way, it will happen correctly, because one thing I like to say is practice makes permanent.
Right.
So if you're practicing something right all the time, well, you're going to end up doing it right all the time. Right. So it's a matter of when you're practicing, make sure you're conscious of everything you're doing. Don't hesitate to practice in front of a mirror. I know it's hard. We don't usually have access to the bells at home. That can be difficult, but when you're practicing at home, mirrors are super useful so you can see exactly what you're doing. Right. And you can notice what you're doing well and what you're doing wrong. And the first step in fixing something is realizing the problem's there, right?
So if I am at home and because I'm trying to practice in front of a mirror, do you have any, what would you recommend as a prop to try and, if I don't have a bell at home, which I probably don't, is there anything I can use, weighted, that would be appropriate?
That's a good question. I don't think I've ever really had to do that with the big bells. But you could, I guess you could, if you have those weights that you can change them. You just put weight on one side, and that could work actually if you have that. And the bass bells are probably not more than 10 pounds, I think, unless you're playing like a C2 or something. So you could probably like do something with 5 or 10 pounds, and it would probably be a good option. I mean, if you feel like DIYing anything, you can use a small bucket for $2 from Canadian Tire and put hockey pucks into them and tape some kind of stick at the bottom, and then it'll be the shape of a bell and the weight of a bell.
That is amazing, Don. I was going to suggest like using a dumbbell and loading it at one end like you suggested, but the hockey puck idea and taping a hockey stick to it is that is way out there, and I applaud you for even thinking of that.
You can always, if you're creative, you can always make something that will work.
Awesome, thanks. I'll have to try and integrate something like that into my practice. Great advice, Dom.
And I see that Maggie wrote ketchup puddles in the chat. But if you're practicing bass bells, you might need to get the Costco ones.
Yeah, and also a word of advice, if you are using a bottle with liquid in it, make sure the liquid is non-staining, because you will eventually have an accident. This always happens. So,
although if you're practicing in front of your bathroom mirror, it's usually easier to clean than a bedroom.
Good point. Dom, you mentioned in the video that you recommend padding for the inside of your gloves.
Mm-hmm.
Can you give us any suggestions of what that material should be made out of?
Yeah, I can give you a few. Actually, I have a few gloves here just to show. I mean, they're black. It doesn't show really well, but these are the standard handbell gloves without the Velcro. There's no padding there. But this one here is the one that you get with the Velcro on top. And there's an extra layer on top of the thumb and the index, exactly where the bass bell would be. So that's a start. That's what I use for most of my bass ringing, because usually if it's an hour-long rehearsal or a church service, for the length of time, it won't affect my playing too much. But if we're getting into something more like a festival where you're ringing from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. almost nonstop, one thing I did actually last festival is these very cheap dollar store gloves. I put them underneath my ringing glove, 2 layers, because it brings down the friction a lot. Because the layers are moving against each other rather than the top layer against the bottom layer, which is your skin. The other options are different kinds of tape. Athletic tape is used a lot. I know Larry Sue uses that. He is probably like the most prominent bass ringer in the world right now. He uses the athletic tape. It's super cheap. You can get it just about anywhere, Shoppers or any sports store, and it doesn't leave any residue after, and it's cheap. That's the very nice part of it, because you don't want to use tape that's $30 a roll if you're gonna have to put like 6 or 7 layers on your hands. That gets expensive very quickly. And I mean, sometimes your director might not like it, but there's nothing wrong with using the hardware store gloves with padding. I don't think I've ever used those specifically, but they've got extra padding. Those are from Home Depot. I think they're $5. They've got a lot of padding. They've got the Velcro. They don't move, and there's different sizes. Sometimes cheap is a good option. The only downside is the bright yellow lines on them. But if your director doesn't mind, I think health is more important than being pretty when you're making music. But those are options, and any tape will work. Any kind of tape or padding that you can get in wrappings at Shoppers will be a good option, because it's meant to be used on the human body. I would advise against stuff like duct tape or gaffer tape. It's very sticky, and duct tape is also quite elastic. It's not something you want. You want something that will not move too much, so that it can take the friction that the bell's going to create. But experiment. Don't hesitate to experiment. Everything is we're all different. You need something that's comfortable. That's the key part to ringing. So long as you're comfortable and it prevents the friction to getting onto your hands, you're good. That's really the key part.
Yeah, and to speak to Dom's, your suggestions about experimenting, I've actually tried various types of gloves, like not just handbell gloves. I too have tried gloves from Home Depot, gardening gloves. I've also tried equestrian gloves, riding gloves. Those are quite comfortable, and they often come in different sizes, as well as sailing gloves. So sailing gloves often have a lot of extra padding right in this U area where your thumb and index finger meet, and sometimes in the palms too. What I found was that I have small hands, so I need gloves that are fitted for a small hand, and I found that the fit was the most important thing. When the glove was too big, it actually ended up, the material would fold, and I would end up with strange blisters in spots where the material did fold. So for me, it was a matter of experimenting and finding gloves that fit well, and that had, good amounts of padding in the right spots. But yeah, it was very much trial and error for me too. So yeah, so there you go.
You're mentioning a good point. If the glove is too big, the glove will move, and that will create extra friction, and that's what we're trying to avoid. The friction between the heavy bell and the hand is what will create the blisters anyway. So if you're using tape that moves, that's elastic, or if you're using gloves that are too big, yes, you're creating more friction. It's not going to help anything. So yes, the glove needs to fit, and the padding needs to fit the glove, and you need to be comfortable.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you. Excellent suggestions. In your video, Dom, you do a lot of weaving, whether you know it or not. You're weaving all the time, and I know this tutorial is not on weaving, but I'm wondering if you could are there some things that we should watch out for in terms of weaving when you're weaving with big bells?
Well, first thing is, if you're playing bass bells, you will be weaving. There's no choice. I don't know any director that will assign you just 2 bells in the low octave. You're never going to play more than 5 notes in the piece. It's going to be boring, so tip to directors, don't do that. But yeah, weaving is key to bass bells. So definitely any workshop that comes out on weaving, check those out. Practice your weaves. They're super important. There's a few ones you will use a lot when you're playing bass bells, and it's if you're playing a run, you're going to pick one bell and drop it right away while your other hand is ringing the second bell. I don't know what the name of that weave is, but the first bell is the one that gets damped on the table because you don't have time to do anything else when you're weaving bass bells. Damp it on the table, ring the second while you're lifting the third, and you'll need your footwork to be adequate because the bass bells they're big. You're moving a lot. You're not staying in position often. So know your weaves. Watch your footwork. You want to be stable at all times. Watch how you're lifting the bells. As I mentioned in the video, it's a step that's often understated in playing bass bells. The lifting is one of the parts that will hurt you the most. And when you're weaving, you're going to try and do it quickly without thinking. You really have to be careful about lifting the bells when you're weaving because it's going to be fast. And make sure you're doing it correctly. It might be worth to sometimes to avoid weaves, look if the assignments can be changed as well. With bass bells, that's an option that you have. In the battery, you wouldn't do that. You don't give the G4 to someone else just because it would create a weave. You just weave those bells. But in the bass bell world, you can rejig the assignments if your ringers are good with that. Some ringers have more trouble getting new assignments, definitely, but try to create an assignment that makes weaving not super common. So I did mention in the handout, C to F is a really bad idea. Those bells are gigantic, and they will play in quick successions. If you have a scale, you're playing C, D, E, F, it's quick weave. try to avoid that. There are pieces where you can play those 4 bells and it works without quit weaving, and fine, if it works, perfect. But try to avoid weaving if you can, and if you can't, make sure you do it right. So footwork, making sure even if you're moving quickly, you're holding the bells safely. You're lifting them safely.
I just wanted to highlight some of the recommendations that Dom made. One, footwork. A lot of bell players often just stand with their feet planted, and you can get away with this in the battery because the bells are close together. You often don't need to reach very far. But when you're in the bass, you really do need to be careful because the bell itself is bigger, and therefore you need more space for them horizontally. So you have to be aware that you need to move side to side to get from one bell to the next. And if you move, then you can make sure that your body is centered as you are picking up the bell, because as Dom mentioned, that the lifting part is the part that's really hard on your joints. It's hard on your forearm, it's hard on your wrist. You need to make sure that you are aligned properly so that you can lift the bell in a healthy way and not injure yourself. And the other thing, at least from my perspective, I'm of smaller stature, so I make sure that the bells that I'm using are close to me, that I don't have to do anything crazy like reach really far for a bell at the far end of the table, because that's going to open me up to injuring myself. So anything that I do use, I make sure I pull it in close to myself so that I don't have to fight. I don't have to fight the layout of my bells on the table when I am especially with weaves and in a rush. So bell placement and good footwork. So don't be afraid to move your feet so that it makes it easier on yourself. You want to make the ringing mechanics as easy as possible on your body so that you can keep doing it.
I can actually jump on. You mentioned bell placement on the table. That's super important for not only for weaving, but for bass playing in general. It's very standard to want to try to put your bells in the order that they are from low to high, and usually that's fine for most pieces. But if you have a piece that has 2-3 key changes and you have an F sharp, you're playing the F sharp. It's assigned to you, and there's 2 in the pieces. There's only 2 F sharps in the whole piece, and it's the bell that's right in the middle of your bells. You don't want it in the middle of your bell setup on the table. You're only using it twice. Put it somewhere where you don't need it, where you, on the side, so you can reach it for the 2 times you need it, and then reach it when you need it, because otherwise it'll mess up all your weaves because you have to reach over that F sharp that's in the middle. Don't hesitate to be creative with the placement of your bells. I've sometimes with the bass bells, you're not using the music stand that's on the table. You're using a music stand that's on the ground, like a regular music stand, if you will. So sometimes you can put 2 rows of bells in front of you. So sometimes I will keep the ones I use a lot close to me, and then the ones I use once or twice further away from me. I do change the layout of my bell table in the bass every piece. I will, if I don't use a bell, I put it vertically in the corner of the table so that I don't think I'm going to use it. I don't even think of ringing that bell. It's in a position that I don't think about it. It's not in my setup, and I do change my setup to make it easy. Sometimes I call it preparing my choreography. It's almost like dancing. You want to know where you're going next. So you want to place your bells in the way that will help, and that will help everything, but your weaves especially. You want your bells to be placed somewhere that's helpful. And obviously, sometimes you're using bass bell technique, but you're just playing C and D4, and then you just have two bells, and that's fine too. You don't need to reinvent the wheel if you're just playing 2 or 3 bells. But if you're playing in the 3s or even the 2s, you will be playing many bells. I've had 7 or 8 bell setups before, quite often. It happens.
So
I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think so, yeah. Actually, to segue into my next question, when you are doing the bell assignments at the bass table, how do you work out the best sharing between you and your friend who's also down at the bass table? Do you have any recommendations?
Yes. If you're a ringer and not the director, make sure your director is okay with you signing the bells. That's my first hint there.
Yeah, make sure your director isn't a tyrant and is willing to let you, could give you some leeway, right?
Yes, exactly. That's one. There's many things you have to think about. If you have one ringer that's more experienced, and the other one is fairly new, bass ringing can be daunting at first. So if you have a way to put more bells into the experienced one, that can be a good idea. But definitely the first thing I look is what the piece is like. If it's scales all the time, well, then you definitely avoid the C to F and G to B. That is the worst thing you can do if it's got scales everywhere, because that means it's going to be weave land and nonstop weave land, and that's really bad for your ringers. It's hard, first of all, for no reason, and it's hard on your body. One that I really like is the lines and spaces. It works really well for a lot of stuff. So for example, one ringer is going to have C, E, G, and B, which is the lines, and for the threes at least, it's the lines. And D, F, and A are going to be the spaces. That works really well for runs. You still have to weave, but you're weaving at half the speed as you would if you were playing the scale on your own, which is very useful. Another one that I really like, because the lines and spaces, sometimes you have fifths. If you're playing C and G and you're playing C and G, well, you're playing two bells at once for a while sometimes. And that's not easy. Sorry, that's not easy, and that's hard on your body. And depending on the brand, those bells are actually fairly different in size and weight. And so it's kind of lopsided on the body as well. So what I suggest for those is to, if it's got scales and a lot of fifths, my favorite is the one I call the Hilti assignment. So it's in fourths. So for example, one ringer is going to have C, F, and B. The next one's going to have D, G, and C4. And the next one has E, A, and D4. The problem with that is you need three people. And you need a C, instead of having a dedicated C and D4 ringer, you have, that person, they're not part of the bass table. So they have to be able to lift that E3. So you need three people who can lift the bass bells. Sometimes it doesn't work, but I find it avoids a lot of problems because you don't play fourths together in the low range pretty much ever. And you will not have to weave very fast because your bells are a fourth apart. There's two other notes in between. So you're very unlikely to have to weave those bells, or if you are, at least the one you're likely to pick up last is the C or D4, and it's fairly light. So you're limiting the hurt factor that way. But look at how the piece. It's basically what bells are used in the piece. Sometimes you have a piece that only uses diatonic, and that might be easier. If there's a lot of chromatics, sometimes it's worth looking at, okay, maybe it's better for that ringer to play the E, but the E flat should be the other ringer. Don't hesitate to make graphs. Which bells play together? If they play together a lot, you don't want to assign them to the same person. If they never play together, it makes sense to put them with the same player. He just has to change his footwork to the next part of the table, and that's the new setup kind of thing. That's an option. So those are basically the things I think about. So ask your director if you're allowed to do the assignment, and then look at what the piece is like, and go with what's in the piece. Sometimes there are pieces where the threes barely play anything, and one person can do it. It happens. There are pieces like that. I've played them, and there's the exact opposite where it would be better to have three people.
Right. Sounds good. It depends on context, eh?
Oh yes, very much so. That's the one thing. The battery usually it's fairly simple. You know, you have your two bells and you're ringing away. But as soon as you get, it's kind of like the top octaves. You know, some groups will have four in hand. Some will do octaves and Shelley. Some will change between the contexts. So it's the same thing in the bass. The context dictates what you have to do. Your ringers and the music are the two factors that you want to keep in mind when you're assigning the bells.
Dom, those seem like two critical pieces of information to take away from this Q&A session and the tutorial. It's been an excellent discussion. It sounds like we could actually have part 2 of ringing with percussions because it is such a specialty. But I think that we will close off this portion of the Q&A session and thank Dom in particular for putting the video together, and thank you for being the host of the Q&A session. Thank you to the participants for joining in the Q&A session, particularly on this beautiful day. And we encourage you to join the rest of Dom's tutorials when they happen and put them on your calendar, and encourage other members of your choirs to join in as well.
Yes, thanks again, Dom, for all your great advice. I'm going to have to try and incorporate all that into my ringing. So everyone, please mark Saturday, November 14th on your calendars and plan on being part of OGEHR's next video tutorial session. Lisa Kyriakides will be joining us again. She will be presenting a video called Conducting the Basics. If you've ever been confused what the conductor is doing with her hands, flapping them about in front of you, who knows why, attend this session. Lisa will give you all the background and all the hints and tips for you to finally decipher what it is your conductor is trying to communicate to you as she is waving her arms frantically in front of the bell table. So all you need for this session are your hands. So make sure you bring your hands to the session, and we look forward to seeing you on Saturday, November 14th.
On behalf of the Ontario Guild of English Handbell Ringers, thank you for participating today. Stay safe, keep well, and ring on.